Now, are employers within their rights to exclude employees from the workplace who cannot produce their vaccination certificate? Well, one legal expert believes that they actually can. And he joins us now. He's Senior Legal Advisor at Strata-g Labour Solutions, Mr. Justin Hattingh. Thank you so much for your time this afternoon. So you are saying that employers actually have the right to ask for a vaccination certificate?
Absolutely, but what we need to do before we say, well, this is what an employer is entitled to do, is we also need to make sure that there's a pandemic policy in place which has been brought to employees' attention, that they know the contents thereof and that they know what the consequences of not complying with that pandemic policy are within the workplace. So any employee that unreasonably refuses would then be liable to disciplinary action against themselves and possibly dismissal.
What we heard the President say, Mr. Hattingh, is that no one should be or will be discriminated in any way or form should they decide not to take the vaccine for themselves. He said no one will be excluded from sporting activities, no one should be excluded from work. How does that then tie in with what you are saying?
I hear that, and it becomes very difficult. It becomes a balancing act. And what needs to happen here is we need to know that employers have a duty to ensure a safe and healthy working environment. And the way that they do that is to put a policy in place which then requires employees to go for the vaccinations, to self-isolate, to quarantine when they've come into contact, and then to produce a fitness to return to work assessment before they can return to work. Now, if an employee wants to work for that company, then they need to agree to those policies and procedures. If they do not want to be subject to that, and they don't have a reasonable objection to going for a vaccine or producing proof of vaccine, such as religious or medical grounds, then they need to go and find another employer, unfortunately. The reality is we all have a responsibility and a duty to ensure safety and compliance with the COVID-19 regulations. And I think that's the way we need to do it. Now, if an employee has a reasonable ground for objecting to it, such as their religious beliefs, or maybe there's a medical condition which precludes them from taking certain medication, then it needs to be brought to the employer's attention, and the employer then needs to be given an opportunity to at least try and accommodate that employee and find alternatives. So if an employee does not want to take the vaccine, but would still like to continue in their employment, then the employer can look at allowing that person to work from home. Alternatively, if there's no option to allow that person to work from home, then you can accommodate them by putting them in an office that might be far removed from other employees and then limiting their interaction. So it really does become a balancing act.
I understand when you say that employers have an obligation to maintain the Disaster Management Act and to stick to it. If we look at where we are now, with the treatment or in finding out about COVID-19, the vaccine rollout has not begun at all. And where we are is at a point where if you're feeling any sort of symptoms or are systematic, or if you've been exposed to somebody with COVID-19, then you would go for the testing and then you would then take the requisite actions there. Is that not enough as far as ring-fencing yourself and abiding to the Disaster Management Act? Going for the test when required to do so, and also then isolating or quarantining yourself depending on what the outcome is?
100%. So I think the best defense against being exposed or contracting the coronavirus is obviously for us to ensure that we follow the regulations, that we wear our masks, that we social distance, that we sanitize regularly and wash our hands, as has been repeated ad nauseum. But I also think that we need to use every single tool that is available to us. And if there's a vaccine that is going to be effective, then employees and employers alike should actually consider, undergoing that vaccine and just giving themselves that extra layer of protection, and other employees as well, because it doesn't only affect me in my personal capacity as one employee working for a company. I could go expose other employees to this risk, shut down a company, and affect a whole lot of other people's livelihoods.
One last question before I let you go, Mr. Hattingh. It sounds to me that you're saying that it's actually compulsory to take the vaccine, because the repercussions of not taking the vaccine mean that you could then lose your livelihood and any other benefits that you have as a citizen and that you enjoy under the Constitution.
So I'll clarify and say that it will only become compulsory if it is part of the employment agreement between an employee and their employer, and it's in a actual pandemic policy where people have in fact agreed to it. So in the event that someone then does not undergo their vaccine or does not provide proof of vaccine, and there's an unreasonable refusal and this employee can't be accommodated, then it is possible that they can be disciplined in terms of that pandemic policy. As I said, it can't make any inroads into your personal life, but unfortunately, there is a management prerogative which allows employers to put certain practices and policies in place, and employees would then have to comply with those.
Mr. Hattingh, thank you very much for that perspective. That's Justin Hattingh, and he's a senior legal advisor at Strata-g Labour Solutions. And it's still very early days of dealing with COVID-19 and how that is going to affect employers, employees, as well as workplace dynamics, as well as the contracts that are going to be entered to between employer and employee in order to ensure that you do actually remain compliant with the Disaster Management Act. But I really do foresee perhaps some class actions regarding this if this does indeed become the reality, if one is forced literally to take the vaccine. Otherwise you lose your benefits, you may even lose your job. But certainly we'll continue focusing on that and keeping a close eye on it.